All right, and welcome back to part two of the cardiovascular system. Yesterday, we talked about the anatomy of the heart. We discussed the heart wall, the pericardium that covering around the heart, and we also talked about the four chambers that make up the heart. The atria being those that are the receiving chambers, being the right atrium and the left atrium. We also discussed the ventricles, being those that are what we call the discharging chambers, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And we briefly talked about how these chambers, how the blood flows through them and out of them, and how we also had these little valves that control when the blood is released and where the blood goes. Those valves being the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve. Those are atrioventricular valves. And then our semilunar valves, which are the pulmonary semilunar and the aortic semilunar. And so the way these valves work is where we left off, and that's where we're going to pick up today. So the way in which these valves work really reminds me of like a trap door almost. You can see here with Shaggy and Scooby, like when the trap door opens and he falls through, and then once he's through, it immediately closes back up again. Our valves within our heart work within a very similar manner. And there's a lot of pressure that's built up on these, and when that pressure is uh, to its breaking point almost, then it's either going to release them, or in other words, where this valve will open up, or it's going to push back against the valve to close it. Another way that these valves open and close, something that's helping them do that, are these things known as the chordae tendineae, which are literally what you could consider heartstrings. It's these little cords right here. And when our muscles in the cardiac muscle in here contracts, it's going to pull on those, which helps open up these valves and also push the blood out. And so when these valves close, what that does is not only kind of signal for the next process to begin, but it's going to prevent that backflow. In other words, our blood is only going to be flowing in one direction and one direction alone. And the reason for this is simply because you don't want backflow. You don't want the blood to flow back into the wrong direction, because it would just create lots of complications. And so the way in which this happens is blood first is going to come into the atriums. We already discussed that. And then once these atriums fill up, they're going to put enough pressure on that it kind of opens up these little valves. And so the blood will flow into the ventricles. Of course, the atria are also going to be contracting at that time, pushing it down in. And the way these little valves work, it just simply allows it to push down this way, but it's not going to allow it to push back up because it would actually close this valve, which is actually what we see happening in the second step, or in the third step, you could say. And so once these atriums are contracted, they push the blood into the ventricles. As these ventricles fill up with fluid, they're going to put pressure back on those valves. In fact, you can even see it zoomed in here, that blood itself creates this pressure, and it's almost like a backflow in a sense, but because of that, it puts enough pressure on there that the blood can't go back through into the atria, which again is important for a consistent flow of blood in the right direction. And so once these ventricles are full to where they're putting that pressure on the valves and the blood can't go anywhere, these ventricles are going to contract and push the blood out through the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, through those semilunar valves. And so then once that blood gets pushed through the semilunar valves, again, very similar to how we had the valves here where they were pushing against it, not letting the blood flow back through the atria, so these semilunar valves are going to have some pressure on them and not allow the blood to flow back down into the ventricles. And so once this happens, There's also going to be blood again in the atriums, and that atrium blood is going to be pushed down into the ventricles, and then that ventricle blood is going to be pushed back into the pulmonary trunk or the aorta, pushing that blood even further, so on and so forth, until the cycle continues over and over and over again. However many times it happens within a minute within your heart until you die. That's basically how the heart operates. So once blood leaves the heart or enters the heart, it's going to do so through certain channels. And we've talked before about arteries and veins, and I know you've heard those terms before, but a lot of people get them mixed up in what they do, or they think they know what they do, but they don't always. And what I mean by that is exactly what we see here, where it says usually carry certain blood. Arteries are usually going to be carrying oxygenated blood, and so we always see arteries in our body colored as red. However, they're not always carrying oxygenated blood, and that's important to note because what our arteries are technically classified isn't what type of blood they're carrying, but which direction they're carrying that blood. And arteries are always going to carry blood away from the heart. And so you can even look down here at our little diagram of our heart, and you can see like the aorta, which is our largest artery. Once that blood leaves the left ventricle and it's pushed out through the aorta, all this oxygenated blood is going to go wherever it needs to into the body. However, if we look at the right ventricle, we see that we're having deoxygenated blood leave the heart. It's going away from the heart. So this pulmonary tube is an artery as well. Even though it has deoxygenated blood, it's still an artery. And so that's why we have to make the distinction of usually oxygenated. And so remember that one, that when we're talking about arteries, it means carrying blood away from the heart. This can include deoxygenated blood with the case of the pulmonary artery. Now, another thing that I want you to notice is looking at this pulmonary artery. You see that when it leaves the heart, it shoots out to the right and to the left. And the reason for that is because to the right and the left of the heart are the lungs. And so once this deoxygenated blood leaves the heart from the right side, it's going to travel through these arteries, because remember, arteries carry it away, to the lungs, where in the lungs, that deoxygenated blood is going to go into the capillaries of what's known as the alveoli in our lungs, and it's going to transfer its carbon dioxide. It's going to pick up some oxygen, and then that same blood is going to go back through the lungs from the right lung and the left lung, and it's going to travel into the heart to the left side of our heart. And anytime we have blood traveling towards the heart, these little vessels, these tubes, are what we consider our veins. And so veins always carry blood towards the heart. And again, just like our arteries, it's usually going to be deoxygenated. In other words, it's not always going to be. Specifically in the case of the pulmonary veins, which again, we have 4 of them, 2 leading from the left lung, 2 of them leading from the right lung. And these veins are bringing oxygenated blood that we just got from the lungs. That way, our heart can pump out that oxygenated blood to everywhere else in the body. And so veins are generally going to be carrying deoxygenated blood because it's taking that blood back to the heart so it can pump it back to the lungs. But in the case of the pulmonary veins, it's also going to be taking that oxygenated blood. Now, another thing I want you to note is the vena cava, which, again, we have the aorta here, which is our largest artery. The vena cava is the large vein that runs basically throughout the body. And it's divided into superior and inferior regions simply because the superior vena cava is the region that comes from the superior portion of the heart or leads into the heart from the superior portion. And then we have the inferior portion, which leads in from the inferior portion of the heart. In other words, from the bottom of the heart. So that's the only distinction between the superior and the inferior. These are still connecting the vena cava to the heart. It's just where is that opening at? And again, this chart just kind of shows you how the blood flows through the system. Now, I don't want you to take away from this diagram thinking that, oh, only deoxygenated blood goes through the right side and only oxygenated blood goes through the left side of our body. That is not the case. All right, this is a very simplified model that's just showing you how our closed circulatory system works. Nonetheless, we have veins and arteries on our right side, and we have veins and arteries on our left side. This is just showing how that circulation process is actually taking place throughout the body, and how it's the right side of the body that's going to be dealing with, or the right side of the heart that's going to be dealing with that deoxygenated blood, where it's the left side of the heart that deals with the oxygenated blood. Now, when we're talking about blood traveling through the heart, we know that the oxygenated blood is the portion of the blood that actually carries the nutrients. And so you might be wondering, how in the world does this portion of the heart, if this is only getting deoxygenated blood, how is it getting the oxygen that it needs to survive? Well, the answer to that is actually the same as how this side is, because when the heart is pumping blood through the atriums and through the ventricles, that blood is actually not doing anything for the heart. Remember, the heart itself, that contractile muscle, is what we call the myocardium. And that myocardium, inside the ventricles and inside the atria, are actually covered by that endocardium. And so, because of that, no nutrients is being absorbed by that material. And so there are specific arteries and veins known as coronary arteries and cardiac veins that are going to be doing that process of giving the heart muscles, that cardiac muscle, giving it the oxygen that it needs to constantly do its job and to take away the carbon dioxide from doing that job. And so, again, once we do, have the that blood that's being taken away from the veins, it will empty directly into the atria, simply so it can into the right atrium, simply so it can go directly back to the lungs to get that oxygen for that fast response. And so, again, just showing you that the blood that travels through the chambers here is not nourishing the heart. In fact, we just have these different cardiac arteries and cardiac veins that are helping us do that job. So how the heart is actually pumping itself, we've talked about how once the pressure builds up inside the atrium, it's going to allow that blood to flow down into the ventricles, and then that ventricle blood is going to flow out into the pulmonary veins and the aortic arch here. But the pressure alone is not enough for it to do that. So there has to be some type of neural stimuli that's going to be doing this, like it's shocking the heart constantly. And our heart actually has its own, you could consider it almost like a little mini nervous system that's actually separate from our nervous system. The brain doesn't have to do any thinking about the heart whatsoever. In fact, it doesn't even have any say, even though it's an automatic response. Our brain, our central nervous system, isn't really responsible for the actions of the heart. it has its own conduction system, what we call a nodal system. All right, nodal referring to a node, which is kind of like a mass of tissue. And we have these two distinguishing nodes within the intrinsic conduction system of the heart. And this, when these fire off, are going to send those electrical impulses through the heart, telling it to contract. And so we have two main nodes, the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. The one that starts off this process is what's known as the sinoatrial node, which is the one located superiorly up here in the right the right atrium. As this one fires off its signal, as you can see here in this little diagram, it sends the signal throughout the fibers here down to the atrioventricular node. This atrioventricular node is then going to send its signal down through the atrioventricular bundle, sometimes referred to as the bundle of His. And this bundle located in the septum is again going to send that signal throughout the rest of the myocardium and telling those cardiac muscles to contract. When those muscles contract, it's going to push whatever blood is in the ventricles out through the pulmonary trunk and the aortic arch, and then the cycle continues over and over and over again, non-stop for the rest of your life. And this is all happening simultaneously without any response from us. Now, can this sometimes mess up? Yes, and that's why people have pacemakers, because sometimes this isn't necessarily either it's not firing at all or it's firing at incorrect beats. In other words, maybe it's going to send a signal twice too fast, or maybe it's going to be sending that signal too slow. And again, if this isn't working at just the right constant rate, then our cycle itself is going to be off and our blood flow is not going to be a smooth, streamlined process. And so that can be very dangerous and lead to stroke and even heart attack. And so that's why some people have to have pacemakers to help deal with that. And so these bundle branches and the Purkinje fibers are relating to that atrioventricular bundle that we were talking about on the last slide, just simply saying that the signal from this atrioventricular bundle is going to travel down through these bundle branches that you can kind of see here in these Purkinje fibers. And that, when these start to get their signal, that's what tells it to contract. And again, as stated earlier, this whole process, again, the reason it's called the pacemaker is because it's the sinoatrial node that initiates the whole contraction sequence of the heart, this autorhythmic cycle, if you will. And so the way in which this happens is what we call the cardiac cycle. So here you can see this stuff known as mid to late diastole, then ventricular systole, and then early diastole. And what in the world does that mean? Well, that's what we're going to look at. And so when the atria are contracting and when the atria are relaxing and the ventricles are relaxing and vice versa, these different times of contraction and relaxation are known as systole and diastole. Systole being when the heart is contracting, diastole being a period of relaxation. And so we look back at that little diagram that we had, and we saw these phrases: mid to late diastole, ventricular diastole, or ventricular systole, and early diastole. What mid to late diastole is that's the beginning of our cycle, where we see that blood is flowing into the ventricles. It's called mid to late diastole, remember diastole being the rest period, because it's late in that rest period. In other words, during this rest, we do have slight contractions, and those contractions are being those of the atrias, or the atriums. And so as these atriums are contracting, we're leaving that period of rest and we're starting the contraction process. When we're into ventricular systole, this is when the pressure builds up in the ventricles themselves, and once those ventricles are full, that signal is sent to tell the ventricles to contract and push the blood out. That's the ventricular systole. And then early diastole is just once this happens and these atriums start to fill back up with blood, that's what diastole is, because it's a system, it's a period of slight rest or early rest. And if you watch this diagram long enough, you can even start to slowly make those out. Even though this is going, at a pretty much normal speed, you can see where those areas of rest are, where we don't see any contractions. Then you see early diastole, then you see ventricle systole as the ventricles contract, and then the process starts all over again. So, how much blood is pumped through your heart each and every minute? Well, there's actually a formula to figure that out, and that process, how much blood is pumped out through a minute, is what's known as somebody's cardiac output. And this is simply somebody's heart rate, in other words, how many beats per minute, times the stroke volume. And the stroke volume itself is how much blood is being pumped by each ventricle. In other words, that's measured in milliliters. And some of you may or may not have heard before, but generally, the resting cardiac output, in other words, what your normal beats per minute are when you're at rest, and how much blood is actually flowing through, is sometimes lower, or at least your heart rate is lower if you are an athlete. So, somebody who is not athletic, their heart is going to be pumping blood at a faster rate when they're just sitting down than somebody who is an athlete. In fact, sometimes it's even been shown to be almost, half the rate of a normal person. And the reason for this is simply because that person works out. And that might seem strange that, how does that really help an athlete if the heart is slowing down? And again, this is at rest we're talking though. And the reason for that is because of the stroke volume. In other words, how much blood is being pumped through the ventricles per beat. And if you are an athlete, your stroke volume is actually higher than the average person. Because you are constantly working out, you're constantly giving these cardiac muscles a challenge, and you're pushing your body knows it needs more blood because your blood carries that oxygen, it carries the nutrients to all your cells, and so it needs to get as much oxygen and nutrients to those cells as possible in the quickest amount of time. And so your heart actually develops this process where it can actually hold more blood each time it beats. And so because of that process, because of that physical workout where you have trained your heart to push more blood through with each beat, your heart doesn't need to beat as much when you're at rest, and so the heart is slowed down because, even though it might beat at, let's say, and I'm just making up numbers here, but let's just say your heart rate is about half of what a normal person would be. So a normal person may be 60 to 80 beats per minute, something like that. That's a very low rate. But let's just say 80 beats per minute for a normal person, whereas somebody who's an athlete might have somewhere around 40 to 50 beats per minute, which seems really low, but you have to remember they're going to have a higher stroke volume. In other words, yes, their heart isn't beating as much as a person who doesn't work out, but because that athlete is somebody who works out, they have that higher stroke volume, that higher amount of blood that can be in the heart, so their heart doesn't need to pump as much. And that's pretty much it. That's uh, how the heart works in a nutshell. Now, there's a whole lot more that we could actually go into about the heart and different things like that, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time to. And this video is also running long enough now. And so that's it for our heart notes. That's where we're going to leave it off. To recap what we talked about today, we talked about how pressure builds up on the valves to close them so they don't have that backflow. We talked about how blood flows through the heart, what that uh, cardiac output is, how the blood circulates. We talked about how it circulates through arteries and veins. Uh, arteries take blood away from the heart, generally going to be oxygenated, but not always. Veins bring blood towards the heart, generally going to be deoxygenated, but not always. And then we also talked about how that blood is moving towards and away from the heart through that uh, blood cycle, through that cardiac cycle, and through the uh, nodal system that helps with that neurologically. And if you have any other questions about the heart or about the blood, let me know and remind, and I will talk to you guys later.